I'm delighted to moderate this wonderful panel, Championing Change, and I think it's a reminder that the purpose of our DEI efforts is for societal change. It's not just tick box exercises, filling out surveys, etc. And there's been really great progress through the industry, through collaborations. So we've seen things like the Joint Commitment come together, creating standards for diversity data collection. We've seen C4 DISC toolkits from inclusive language and anti-racism toolkits. We've seen scholarly research guidelines, the SAGA guidelines, the Trust Code on ethics dumping. So there's lots of progress has been made. But we have to say, dismantling years of systematic racism, sexism, and other inequalities in our society are really not going to happen fast. And this is really a lifelong mission, and we all really need to commit to it. So DEI work is personally and organisationally challenging. So our three speakers here are really here to talk about their experiences, inspire us, and to make change in our organisations. So they're coming from three different perspectives. So we've got the society publications perspective, the higher education institutions and academy perspective, and the library perspective. So I'm delighted to welcome, at the end, Michelle Fleetwood, who's the Publishing Integrity Manager at ACS Publications. She's going to talk about the overarching lessons from producing their third diversity data report. Then we've got Laura Castillo-Page, who's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, and she's going to talk about their consensus studies and also NAS's own DEI actions. And then Elaine Westbrooks is the Carl Kroc University Librarian at Cornell University, so I'm sure she was paying attention to that data about Cornell earlier. And she's going to talk about inclusive collection development. So the format is they're each going to speak for 10 minutes, and then I have some pre-prepared questions I'm going to ask them, so I get in first, and then the floor will be handed over to you, and you have a chance to ask them questions about their talk. It's going to start with Michelle. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for being here today and your attention. As mentioned, I am with the American Chemical Society, specifically our publications division, so I have a publisher's perspective on how we can lead these DEI efforts, and specifically want to talk about our diversity data reports. So just an introduction to the American Chemical Society. We are one of the largest scientific societies across the globe. Our vision and mission are shown here, but really want to focus on our core values. And you'll see one of them is diversity, equity, inclusion, and respect, or what we call DEIR. And I want to share this just to show that, we have DEI really clearly embedded within our organization, which has allowed us at the ACS to really focus on this type of work. So publications, as a part of the American Chemical Society, we also really focus on those core values and adhere to the mission and value in moving forward DEI work. And so as a division, we are really committed to this. And so following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, we published a joint editorial in which our editors and ACS staff committed to, supporting our authors, reviewers, and editors, dismantling bias and discrimination within the publishing process. We also acknowledged our extreme privilege as a publisher and our responsibility to tackle these issues. And within the editorial, we made 5 initial commitments, which are shown here. And that first one is to gather and make public baseline statistics on diversity within our journals and report on this annually. So this is what I'm going to focus on, those diversity data reports. And so we started collecting the demographic data of our authors, reviewers, editors, and editorial advisory boards shortly after that joint editorial was published. And we collect gender, geographic location, racial and ethnic identity, and career stage status of all of these populations. And so in 2021, we published our first report, and this was really used as our baseline, so kind of seeing where we stood currently. And then since then, we've published 2 follow-up reports in 2022 and 2023, really focusing on where we've seen any changes, are there any trends in the demographic data, anywhere where we're kind of stagnant and need to focus our efforts a bit more. These reports also detail all initiatives and programs that we have ongoing within publications that really focus on increasing the diversity and inclusion of our publications portfolio. And last note here is that recently we did transition our survey to align with the joint commitment, which Sarah has mentioned. And so this has allowed us to change our survey up a bit and really collect a lot more data on our authors, reviewers, and editors. So our next report, which will come out later this year, should have a lot more data and insight within it. So now I want to focus on really tangible things here and where we've seen success within the data. And I just want to highlight a couple examples. The first of which, and where we focused our efforts, is diversifying our editorial boards. And we've done this a couple of different ways, which are shown here. The first is through training our editors. So one of those initial commitments that was made in the editorial was to provide training to our editors to identify and dismantle bias within the peer review process. We also provide our editors with tangible ways in which they can increase the diversity and inclusion at their journals. Next, we have altered how we do our editor-in-chief search processes to make sure this is diverse and inclusive as well. So search committees, we have to have gender parity. Also geographic representation needs to be varied, similar to the candidates for EIC's gender equity, as well as that geographic representation as well. And then finally, we have also introduced what we call topic editors, and this is a way of introducing early career researchers, underrepresented researchers geographically, and also focus on emerging topics to the journal. And so with these efforts, we have seen progress in diversifying our editorial boards. So just want to show 2 pieces of data here. The top is looking at gender of our editors over time. And you'll see that there is a shift in looking at men versus women as our editors. I do want to note that prior to 2021, when we launched our survey, we reported on biological sex. We've since switched over to reporting and surveying using gender identity. So want to make sure that we're being inclusive and not just looking at the binary system. And then the bottom graph is looking at geographical distribution over time. Back in 2012, about 3/4 of our editors were from the US and Canada. That's since gone down to about half. So we have seen increased representation from East Asia and the Pacific, as well as Europe and Central Asia. But of course, there's more work to be done here. The next thing I want to highlight is engaging early career chemists. So back in 2021, with our baseline data, we found that across the board, the populations were really focused on mid to late stage career chemists. So we really want to engage with the early career scientists out there. And there are a couple of ways that we've been doing this. We have 2 online courses. The first is ACS Author Lab, which tries to help authors submit strong manuscripts to our journals. We also, of course, teach them about DEIR, make sure that they can communicate respectfully with reviewers and editors throughout the process. And we also have ACS Reviewer Lab, which teaches chemists how to review for our journals. We also teach them about DEIR a couple of ways, most notably looking at biases within the peer review process, how they can identify that and make sure that they're objectively reviewing manuscripts. On the right-hand side, we've also introduced early career boards, early career advisory boards. This places early career researchers in advisory positions within our journals, so it gives them a little bit of leadership opportunities within ACS. And we've also modified our journal and lectureship awards to really focus on early career researchers. So looking at the data here, again, this is just a snapshot of the data. On the, left-hand side here, we're looking at authors and reviewers over time, and looking at that career stage. So over time, we have seen a shift in the younger populations or early career populations, and that trend has been increasing for those 0 to 10 years since their doctorate populations. On the right-hand side, we're looking at editors and editorial advisory boards, and really just looking at 2023. What I want to show here is the EAB members, so the early career advisory boards would fit into that. We have seen an increased proportion of early career chemists within this specific demographic as well, just because of the implementation of those boards. Again, this is just a snapshot of the data. There's a lot of data within these reports, so if you're interested, please go and read those. With that, I don't think we have questions now. We'll take those at the end, so I'll pass it over to Elaine. Thank you.
All right, good morning. It's really good to be here. And I'd just like to start off by saying that one of my areas at Cornell is also overseeing Cornell University Press. So I look at the publishing side, the press side, as well as the library, and I think that really has informed a lot of my decisions and how we move forward. But the first thing I'd like to just mention is that librarianship as a profession is often seen as a passive group or passive purveyors of information. But I think that the mere act of collecting and building collections is very powerful. And through our collections, people are seen and visible. And because they're seen and visible, they can imagine new kinds of worlds and new ways of being and new ways of knowledge. And I think that is just really important to, when we're thinking about the world of libraries and what we do, and also for presses as well. So here's just an overview of my talk, and just trying to paint a picture of some of the things that I think about, like when I get up in the morning, and then when I go to lunch and at dinner, I think about libraries, I think about presses, just to set that context and cover the values and some of the examples, and then we'll talk about how do we think about scholarly communications in terms of equity. So the context in higher ed now is just very different than when I entered the profession 30 years ago. And now we see on today's campuses, we have as many as 25% of our students are identify with a disability. 25%. That is very different. So even today, I get so many requests for students to be able to use library spaces for tests because they are the accommodations we make for students with disabilities. So that's a major point. And then the other thing that is increasingly important is just access to higher ed. And so Cornell, like many institutions, are in the middle of a multi-billion-dollar campaign, and a third of that is dedicated to access to scholarships. And one of the things that Cornell is really proud of is our prison education program, providing access to incarcerated students. And these students are incarcerated, but they are entitled to access just like any other student at Cornell University. And then the other part is when we think about the budget, and particularly of libraries, I just want to be clear that libraries don't typically have levers. Our budget is dedicated to materials, and that's collections and things like that, and people. And then we have a little bit for operations, but we don't have a lot of levers, and we're not really in that grant writing business, although we often do grants. And so that has never changed. That's always been pretty much the makeup of a library budget. And then the third point is that we are deeply driven by our mission to preserve human knowledge. The scholarly record is just part of our DNA, and that is something that we'll never go away from. And of course, with AI and everything has changed, but that is an evergreen mission of we want to preserve that for future generations, and we have to do a better job of doing that in a more inclusive way. And so that is why diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, respect, access, accessibility, whatever you want to call it, remains deeply relevant to our work. Because if we're preserving the scholarly record and knowledge, we have to preserve as much as we can, and we have to make sure that we are inclusive. And we have not done a good job of this, quite frankly. And so I just wanted to talk about this. This is a theory that has been around about this intercultural development. And so one of the challenges we have in higher ed and in libraries in general is that we never really get past the minimization phase, right? So there's 5 phases here. And by that I mean diversity matters, and being able to take advantage of all the diversity in your organization is really important. That's how we have innovation. That's how we bring multiple ideas and perspectives to the table. Is the more diverse, the more identities that you have, the better decisions you can make. The problem is, every organization I've been in, we tend to minimize diversity, right? We try to say, well, we're all the same, and we're not the same. And getting to the acceptance and adaptation phase is just really, really difficult. And I would argue in many of your organizations, you probably have a similar problem. And so we have to realize this is just a marathon that we're embarking on. Another thing I wanted to mention is, despite this fact that we tend to minimize the diversity, the core values of librarianship have been strong and well documented for many, many years. And so we have the Bill of Rights, and we also have the Code of Ethics, which were both authored in 1939. And all of these rights and freedoms that we mentioned, we tend to have these articles, but when we think about the Bill of Rights, it always starts off with access to information. You'll see challenging censorship, privacy, reflecting all viewpoints, and also thinking about libraries as spaces where anybody can come with any identity. And then you get to the core values, which I pretty much mentioned already, but when you think about the Bill of Rights, the Code of Ethics, and all the things that librarians have been talking about for decades, these 5 values really just go through everything we talk about from a day-to-day basis. And so as many publishers out there, access is what we're all about, and we're always thinking about how do we get information in the hands of the people who need it. And I just have to reflect on this moment that we have now. And so this statement was written in 1953, and we have been going back to this, unfortunately, in 2024 with the whole range of bills and things that have been happening that are basically banning and challenging books. And the right to read is something that we have to fight for. And I know all of us in this room are pretty much against censorship, but this is something that we have to continually fight against censorship, and to double down on intellectual freedom and the freedom to read, and that free people read freely. And that is something that we're very much dedicated to. So one of the reasons why we're having such a challenging moment in libraries, and this is obviously since George Floyd, but now, is that our organizations, particularly in higher ed, like, we suffer from these 4 problems, right? One is we have this false harmony where we try to act like there's no conflict, and that we don't we don't embrace the conflict, and we focus on looking harmoniously and not really talking about the problems and obstacles and conflict that we have. Another challenge that we have is that we have this vocational awe, and where we assume that libraries and librarians in and of themselves are good, and it's a profession that's inherently good. That is not the truth. Like, we have great people, we have great values, but that doesn't mean that everything that libraries and librarians do is just automatically good. And then I would say the third area is neutrality. We make choices every day. There's nothing neutral about the way we build collections, the way we design our spaces, the way we do anything. Nothing's neutral. And I think people like to call libraries and archives and museums neutral, and that's just not true. And then the final part is that there is this fear of doing things wrong, and fear of offending people, and a fear that really has changed our climate, particularly today, right? We have a lot of bills that are passing today that are basically outlawing equity and diversity work on university campuses today. And so I think that this fear has always been there, but there's also an additional, I think, level of concern that we really want to have a university and a library that is for everyone. And particularly at my campus, Cornell University was built on any person, any study. That is the motto, and that's how it was. And we really cherish that beginning of Cornell University, to say that was always built for anybody. And so I want to just bring some attention to accessibility. This is something that is really important for us, and we're really doubling down on this as we think about our contracts and how we talk with publishers and vendors. But we're increasingly considering how disability and accessibility factor into library work and libraries in general, like our programs, our services, how our physical spaces. And I just don't think enough attention is paid to accessibility and thinking about it in the same way we think about equity and diversity, inclusion and belonging and respect. So just here's some quick examples of DEI work and the A's for accessibility, but I could guess that every research library I know everyone I've been associated with and everyone I know has some kind of committee that is looking at these issues. In terms of the archives, it is becoming increasingly necessary for us to change our model of how we acquire materials. And so now we've been shifting to a different custody model where it's not my job to get everything and bring it to Ithaca, New York. There are ways to empower communities to preserve their own history. As far as inclusive descriptive practices, this is something that has been really taking hold in many research libraries, actually in most research libraries, where we're acknowledging that metadata description is very biased and that we have a lot of metadata that is overtly exclusionary and racist and sexist and homophobic, and that we have to begin looking at those practices to understand how we can reduce that harm. And then the other area is conscious editing, where we're going in and looking at finding aids, for example, and rethinking the language of erasure and the fact that the default is typically white or the default is typically male. And so we go back and we believe that by making these changes, we are inviting new kinds of people, a broader community into our libraries and into our archives. And then the other thing I would mention is, as I started, was the prison education program. That has really changed the way I think about a lot of things, in that we already know that any prison is going to engage in a high level of censorship. And so we're trying to figure out how do we work around that so that our students are able to get access to materials. And then the other part, and this goes to the accessibility, is just really doubling down on how we enable transcription. And of course, artificial intelligence is really going to help us, but this is something super important for us. And a lot of us did this work during the pandemic when we shut down, and we just started transcribing a lot of stuff because that was one thing that we could do at home. And so I want to mention this, what I call a scholarly communications dilemma. And libraries are always about access, but we believe that these systems in scholarly communication, these are systems, whether it's publishing, higher ed and libraries, or our researchers, I'm very concerned that they're increasingly unaffordable, closed, opaque, and unsustainable. And I think this is what breeds inequity. And this is the conversation that I have on my campus every day, is why can't you buy this, and why not? And then talking about how we understand the work of the academy, and that we publish for impact. Societal impact is important, and I have a conversation with faculty all the time about, instead of worrying about your impact factor, you should be worried about how your research is going to improve our society. And how do we set up promotion and tenure committees to care about that social impact? And so moving forward, I just think we have to find ways to make a more equitable system, and really thinking about, and so for example, even with incarcerated students, just really trying to figure out, well, how do we get information in their hands? And that having these online systems actually is not going to reach them, that we need to package information in very different kinds of ways. And if, for example, in the state of New York, if you're an incarcerated student, we are not allowed to share a resource with the state of New York. So you can imagine, how do you teach geography to a person if you cannot show a map of the state that they actually live in? Number two, I think we have to take accessibility more seriously. This is a liability for universities. We're getting sued because our materials or our resources are not accessible. And then I'm really happy that Dr. Ellis mentioned the AI a lot in your keynote, because this is something that we just think about on a daily basis, is the humanity and the importance of AI to be used ethically and responsibly. And then I think the fourth area is privacy. We, in the library profession, we are very concerned about privacy and being able to help our students be able to access the information they have and not have to really sacrifice all their privacy in order to be a student at Cornell or otherwise. So I think the questions are coming later, so I'll hand it over.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. Delighted to be here with all of you today. So what I'd like to cover today is I'm at the National Academies for Science, Engineering, and Medicine, short for, we say, National Academies. So I'll share a little bit about us if you're not familiar with our organization. And then I'm going to highlight some of the work that we do, in particular our consensus studies. So I'm just going to give you a little sampling of that. We do a lot of work on DEI topics, and I really welcome you to visit, in particular, our DEI resource page at the National Academies. And then just provide some examples of how we are prioritizing DEI in our work, in particular our consensus studies. So I just joined the National Academies about 3 years ago as their Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer, and I was brought in to develop and implement our DEI strategy that impacts the entire organization. So I just want to highlight some of this work here with you today. So a little bit first about who we are, the National Academies, and then I'll move into the examples. So the National Academies, often people think we are part of government. We are not. We were established in 1863 by President Lincoln, but we are a nonprofit private institution. And if you've participated in our work or are familiar with our work, you would know that every year we bring thousands of advisors and world-leading experts in STEM to participate in our work, whether it be in our consensus studies, roundtables, workshops, in an advisory capacity, in many different forms. And our work is known for taking a pretty rigorous process for producing our consensus studies, and they are seen as independent, objective, and people really value the consensus process. And we do have, our work does impact policy and decision makers. And so our mission here is to provide independent, trustworthy advice and facilitate solutions to complex challenges by mobilizing expertise, practice, and knowledge in science, engineering, and medicine. And I highlight here our core values, which are independence, objectivity, rigor, integrity, inclusivity, and truth. When I joined the academies, we had a DEI statement, but we had the opportunity to make it a bit more robust. And so just last October, we launched this new statement and new guiding principles that inform our work. And so in the statement, you see that we value diversity among our staff, our members, our volunteers. Those are the experts we bring together on a yearly basis, but also our partners, our vendors, and our multiple audiences. And we recognize that the many perspectives enhance the quality of our work and drive innovation and impact. Essentially, we couldn't do this work without diverse individuals coming to the table. And we're committed to cultivating a workplace culture and climate that promotes inclusion, belonging, also accessibility, and anti-racism, and that upholds equity and values the participation, right, of all of those who engage in contributing to our mission. Our guiding principles really give you a sense of how it kind of sort of animates our statement. And so we want to integrate diverse perspective and experiences into our programs, our policies, our practices, and our products. We want to foster a culture of inclusion where all staff, members, volunteers have full access to participate and they feel welcome, respected, valued, and a sense of belonging. And that we approach the scientific endeavors with a consideration of diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks, and I'll share some of that work with you today. And lastly, cultivate mutually beneficial diverse partnerships and collaborations, and I'll share some examples there today as well. So the National Academies, we can be quite complicated sometimes to understand. We have 3 academies: science, engineering, and medicine. I often feel like I've walked into an organization where there are maybe 11 smaller organizations, and then we have what we call our 7 program divisions. And for example, our division in behavioral and social science and education, you get a sense of the type of work that they do, and I'm going to highlight some of their work here today. We have earth and life sciences, engineering and physical sciences, health and medicine division, and policy and global affairs, transportation research, and the Gulf Research Program. So those are our big 7 programmatic areas where a lot of our work comes from. So let me talk a little bit about our consensus studies, and I highlighted 2 areas. One, give you a few examples of some of our work that look at the intersection of DEI in STEM topics. And then I want to highlight some of our workforce diversity topics, which I've called here Enhancing Pathways and Broadening Participation in STEM Workforce. And we do a lot of work in both of these areas. So I'm not going to go into a lot of these, I just sort of the details. These are pretty robust reports, but I just want to highlight a few. So looking at this topic around the intersection of DEI and STEM topics, I want to highlight this report from 2023 that looks at the criminal justice system and reducing racial inequalities. And if you look at the report, you'd see evidence on community-based solutions, non-criminal policy interventions, and criminal justice reforms, and all strategies to move towards improving community safety as well. So this is a report we're really pleased to have released last year. Here's another study I would highlight around closing the opportunity gap for young children. The study covers the causes and the costs and the effects of the opportunity gap in young children and explores how disparities in access to quality education experiences, healthcare, and positive developmental experiences from birth through age 8, and how it intersects with key academic, health, and economic outcomes. Another study here around measuring sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And so this was a report that we did for the National Institutes of Health. And it recommends adopting new practices for collecting data. And we also apply this to ourselves, moving from just focusing on biological sex data, but also looking at gender identity, sexual orientation, and also discusses, right, that sex is a biological variable. So again, just wanted to highlight a different type of study here for you. And then as we look at our workforce diversity programs, this is one of our popular studies. It was produced in 2020, still highly used and cited, promising practices for addressing the underrepresentation of women in science, engineering, and medicine. The report looks at the existing research on policies and practices and programs and other interventions for improving the recruitment, the retention, and the sustained advancement into leadership roles of women in these disciplines. One of our recent reports, just launched in 2022, more specifically looks at women of color in tech fields. If we think we're not doing so well in some of the other STEM fields, there's a lot more we need to do in technology when it comes to the advancement of women. And so the report recommends a broad set of stakeholders within the tech ecosystem for increasing the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women of color, and identifies some recommendations that leaders can take on. And then specifically wanted to highlight this report. This has been a big focus as we move into this post-COVID area. And so this report looks specifically at COVID-19 and the impact of careers of women in academic sciences, and specifically focuses on the impact during the initial 9-month period, and how that has impacted women in their careers. And then highlighting this study, looking at another field in STEM, advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility in the leadership of space missions. And so this is a report that provides guidance in particular to NASA and the steps and opportunities that the leadership can take to address diversity in this field. And then I believe you referenced our newest report. This is our 2023, Advancing Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in STEM. So this report, I have to tell you, I just checked the numbers yesterday with our communications, was the most downloaded report in 2023. There was a lot of anticipation that this report was coming out, and it does a wonderful job in reviewing the evidence and looking at racism and how it's systematically embedded in our systems. It identifies barriers for individuals in accessing higher education, but also in advancement in higher education, and then provide some really good guidelines for our leadership around mitigating bias and reviewing our policies and practices and procedures from an anti-racism lens to establishing metrics and assessments. So pretty comprehensive report. And let me just highlight one more thing. I mentioned that the work that I do also is advancing DI internally within the national academies. And so we took this report last summer and conducted a series of DI dialogue sessions with staff across the organization, reviewing the report chapter by chapter and really thinking about how it applies also to us. So I think we often, we sometimes produce reports and we put it out there, but we also need to practice what we preach. And so we're very intentional in making sure that our recommendations are also apply to us. And so that was a really wonderful experience to go through that. And it took a lot of time, but we learned a lot from our own report. So let me wrap up by sharing a couple of priority areas for increasing diversity in our programmatic activities. I know I only had 10 minutes, so I just created this one slide here. So a couple of things I would share. One of our bigger initiatives this year is enhancing our community engagement efforts. We realize that a lot of the work that we do, and in fact many of our sponsors, are looking for us to do better when it comes to engaging communities. And so we're looking at currently doing an assessment to understand where are our strengths, where are some areas of opportunity for us to do this work much more effectively. And then the other piece that I would share here, somewhat connected, is we've been doing much more around incorporating the evidence from lived experience into our analyses. And so that report that I just mentioned from 2023, we did incorporate the lived experiences of individuals from minority communities and backgrounds into that report. A couple of other areas I would highlight is expanding volunteer and member demographic data collection. Just last year, we launched a new data collection process to understand our volunteers and our members. How are we going to move forward if we don't even know what our data looks like? And so we took some of the advice from the report that I mentioned earlier around measuring sex and gender identity and how we develop our own data collection process. Establishing partnerships with diverse professional membership organizations. That is a big priority for us. We know that some people know us and know our work, but others do not. And so we're being more proactive and reaching out to these diverse professional membership organizations so that those members have an opportunity to participate in our work. And we get to also, it's a mutual beneficial partnership. Incorporating strategies for increasing diversity of committees and reviewers. I mentioned at the beginning that having diversity in our committee slates is key for us to be able to produce the work that we do. And so we've established a number of processes and procedures internally to make sure that we produce diverse committee slates that then impact our work and our outcomes. And then lastly, I would share that we're being very thoughtful in ensuring the issues of DEI are considered during the project development, approval, and throughout the life cycle of activities. It's not just enough to just consider it at one point in time. You have to be very intentional and consider it from the beginning and throughout the process, and I'm happy to discuss that further. And I think with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Great. Thank you, Laura. It's inspiring to hear from all of you about the work that you're doing, and we're just embarking on our own DEI activities for STM to actually look at all our committees. So I think we've got a lot to learn from you all about the way you've approached everything. So the first question I wanted to ask you, which is perhaps an obvious one, is what do you think the biggest challenges to making progress in DEI is for your program or your communities that you serve?
I think for a publisher, what I think is one of the largest challenges is making sure that the pipeline is also focused on diversity and inclusion and equity. As a publisher, there's only so much we can influence, and so there's a lot of work that needs to be done kind of upstream within the pipeline to ensure that we're including diverse voices and perspectives, and making sure that education is equitable, funding is also equitable, so that when you get to the publishing process, we have a diverse pool of authors, reviewers, and researchers. And I think as a society publisher, we do have maybe a bit more influence in kind of going upstream and making sure that those pools are a bit more diverse and inclusive. But it is hard kind of being siloed as a publisher and wanting to influence, the influx of researchers that we ultimately get. But I'll pause there and let others answer.
Great. Who wants to go next?
I can chime in. I would say, not that this is necessarily a challenge we have, but that I see a lot in many organizations that don't recognize the amount of time and resources that are needed to do this work. This doesn't just happen automatically, right? And so you need, one, make sure that staff are trained and understand how to do the work, but that you have staff that are committed to doing this work, just like we do in other fields, right? We wouldn't just, in IT, just say, you got a laptop once, we don't need to provide you any additional IT resources, right? So we have to continually invest in this work in order for us to, and monitor our progress. I think we have to be a lot more sophisticated in this space and look at evaluate our efforts and see, and if we need to pivot and change course, we do so. So that takes resources and time. And I think, given the current political climate, I think that's a challenge, right? And staying the course. And I think we've heard a consistency, right, in all of the speakers in sort of a commitment to this work and not doubling down, but really sort of staying the course and continuing to advance these efforts. And we've seen this before. This work is sometimes about like an emotional roller coaster. Sometimes we're doing well, we're thriving, and sometimes, we're under attack, and here we are again. So I think staying the course and making sure you have the resources and continue to dedicate time to do this work, because it doesn't just happen automatically.
Yeah, and I think that's also important for our different sizes of membership. So if you're a large organisation like the American Chemical Society, you will have resources. If you're a small society, it's going to be much harder.
That's right.
So I think how we develop resources that can flow and become best practices for our smaller organisations is important in our community of societies, broader than just STM societies, I think. So Elaine.
I would just add that we lack strategy I think we want to do the work, but we don't, there's a knowledge gap where people don't understand the work. And I think there's a commitment challenge as well, that we do not really see the levels of commitment that are necessary to do this really difficult work, and we need to align the incentives as well. There's no reward for doing this work. It's very hard to reward people for this. So those are the big challenges that I see. I mean, this kind of work should be about our future. And for many, many years, I've been building collections, and there's something to offend everyone in my collection, I guarantee you. That's the way it's supposed to be. Yet this is being more and more contested, and that's a big challenge for us.
Second question is, who is doing work you admire advancing DEI, and why? And I'm going to start with Laura.
So I don't want to be biased here, but prior to joining the National Academies, I worked at the Association of American Medical Colleges. And the AAMC represents the MD granting medical schools in over 400 teaching hospitals in the US and Canada. And I spent 16 years of my career there, in part because of their true commitment to this work. It was work that had the leadership support. We did a lot of work and a lot of research showing the impact of diversity in our physician workforce and how it impacts quality of care and just people get access to care. And I had the opportunity to work with a really diverse membership and to be able to really impact diversity in the medicine field, which we know is ultimately about saving lives. Maybe it was part of the mission, just to really align well with this work. And as I look now at other STEM fields, you know, we are doing much better around these issues in medicine. Not perfect, of course, but definitely doing much better in comparison to other STEM fields. So I really credit the Association of American Medical Colleges for having that deep commitment and the resources to do that work. But there's so many other places that I respect, but just that one came to mind.
Great. Elaine?
I would just say that I'm really thinking about the leaders that I think have a strategy and who are doing bold things. And I would say Trevor Dawes at University of Delaware is doing some great work. And Maria Estorino at UNC Chapel Hill is doing some amazing work.
Great, so we'll look them up afterwards, see what they're up to, follow them on LinkedIn or wherever they are. And how about you, Michelle?
I know you mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll just plug them again, is C4DISC, which is a coalition for, I'm going to mess this up, inclusivity, diversity, and scholarly communication. And they have produced a handful of toolkits for publishers and other organizations to use and modify as they'd like to enhance DEI at their own organizations. So I know they've produced a few around anti-racism. I think they have one coming out shortly about disability. So definitely look those up if you haven't already. They're great. And again, if you don't have the resources to make your own toolkit, these can easily be adapted for your own organization.
Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to the floor and see if we have questions from our audience. There's a few near you, Gordon.
Thank you so much. This was a really valuable panel. Anita de Waard with Elsevier. I'm part of a group called Elsevier Enabled, which is to improve our company, to improve accessibility across our companies. I was very intrigued, especially by Elaine Westbrook's comments on bias in metadata and also improving accessibility. And one of the things we're doing is providing alt texts for all images, which is a European project. But I was wondering if you had any concrete examples of how we as publishers could improve accessibility of our content, and especially this comment on bias in metadata I found very interesting, and if there's anything we can do to reduce that. Both of those, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and of course the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say that I guess there are two things. I mean, one thing I'm really dealing with now is our indigenous materials, and that one is really just fraught. And so I would really urge publishers to look at how we are describing and thinking about new ways of knowing, And I feel like you need to consult people who are experts in this space, because describing indigenous sacred funerary materials is just, we don't actually have a lexicon in LCSH in our prevailing control vocabulary to really capture indigenous information properly, description. So that would be one area. And I would say in the second area, just with metadata creation in general, I think that there just needs to be two areas. One is retrospectively going back and then setting a standard moving forward. And so I think you could set the standard moving forward and just pay better attention to the terms, and that, and some of the LCSH terms are not acceptable, right? Well, let's just agree on that. And then have the will and commitment to going back and looking at the harmful language that we have used for many, many, many years. And part of what makes it difficult is a lot of it's just erasure. We just act like certain groups didn't exist. And now we have to go back as libraries and make them more present. And so if you have slave records and the most people on this, in this community were enslaved, yet you don't have any records to give any humanity or agency to the bulk of the people who were enslaved, like that's a problem. And so that happens typically in the archival space. So I'm not sure exactly how publishers who were, thinking about today or could move in that space, but that's something I definitely want to think about more. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Fantastic talks. Elaine, my question's also directed to you, but I think it's a question for everyone. I wonder how much thinking about access and inclusion includes thinking about people in libraries that don't have the resources of the academy, and helping them to navigate with their communities through some of the changes in the information landscape that are coming along. And I find it really challenging that you talk about the fact that you have so few resources outside of materials and people, you have so few levers to pull, and yet, we have governments funding big time anti-misinformation campaigns. And yet the very people who are embedded in their communities are closing up, day after day. The people we know that nearly 80% of the US population say they trust and they feel confident in, twice as much as anyone trusts a journalist, for example, to help them navigate information. So on the one hand, this is all, community libraries, school libraries, high school libraries, college libraries are failing. And yet on the other, what we know is that as a route to information for most people, they're essential. And I just find it really strange that those things aren't joined up, and strategy isn't something that's on the table for libraries to support inclusion in that way.
Well, I just think part of it is that we need to better communicate our value, and I think that libraries are a cornerstone of democracy, and that without libraries being stewards of fact, verification, citation, these are really important things that we do. We educate. We play a really important role. So I agree with you 100%. Libraries are trusted. We've always been trusted. Even in the midst of censorship, we still are more trusted than journalism, Congress, healthcare. Like, those are, that's just where we are. So I agree, and I think that libraries are a core part of our social infrastructure, and they need to be funded, and they're not. And I'm particularly well funded at Cornell University, and I have barriers and obstacles, but I know many other libraries, HBCUs and things like that, that have a fraction of the funding, twice as many students, and they're not able to get information in their hands, and that's just really unfortunate.
Laura, do you have a perspective on this from
Well,
academies?
I definitely support the importance of libraries. As I think about even some of the work we're doing on mis and disinformation, we can do that work, and how critically important it is that we have libraries, right, and we continue to advance the research and the evidence. We were talking earlier when we were just meeting that, it is a challenging time right now where, typically you could rely on the evidence to make your case, right, and to have dialogue around, issues that can be seen as contentious, and sometimes that now is not sufficient. And so I think we can't let this sort of impact, right, our evidence, our research. We have to continue to move forward, and hopefully we'll get past this phase, but it just makes this even more challenging where you can't even use the evidence to make a case now. Misinformation is just so rampant.
Yeah, I was actually giving the example that Wikimedia had contacted us last week about Research for Life potentially giving access in our lower income countries to potential editor groups as a way for them to embed evidence and knowledge in their entries. And that's kind of an interesting path. I know some publishers do donate their content to Wikimedia, kind of library, a library collection. But I mean, that's not going to solve the problem, but it's one aspect of it. Okay, any more questions? Robert?
Robert Harrington from the American Mathematical Society. And I guess it's, sorry, Elaine, it's probably for you mostly, though I had a quick question for Michelle.
She's got the brightest top on.
It's true. So, you didn't mention preprint servers, and of course Cornell has, at least in mathematics, physics, and computer science, the archives. I was just wondering, in terms of DEI initiatives and access, and particularly it's focused these days on preprints and open peer review, I was wondering if you could comment on that. Certainly at the AMS, American Mathematical Society, we're also focusing on whether we can go back and make accessible HTML forms of complex math in our digital archive of both ebooks and journals. So that's just something I wanted to mention, and wondered how much you're seeing of that. And then the question for Michelle is, I was wondering whether you'd consider double anonymous peer review at the ACS as well, because we've tried that and we're doing it. It was a bit of a battle to get it installed, and the IOPP, Institute of Physics Publishing, has done it as well. So there's a whole load of things I just mentioned rushed off my tongue there, but hopefully you can remember what I just said.
Go on, Elaine, you go first.
As far as archive, I mean, thank you for teeing that up. I mean, the preprint servers are amazing tools, yet they have not produced the benefits that we had hoped. So, for example, you know, I'm still paying the millions of dollars now for less content than I did 15 years ago actually 20 years ago when the archive was produced. Nonetheless, these preprint servers are amazing for science, and we support them heavily, and I have a lot of confidence in Stephanie Orphan, who's the executive director of Archive. I do think having those preprints is one tool that we have at our disposal, but it still doesn't remove the need for that final version of record that we often see. And so what we see is people using the archive and publishing it with Wiley or Springer or whatever as their version of record. And so, so what I would just say is that this preprint movement and the work has to continue, but I also know that there are inequities within that system quite a bit. And I've looked at them and looked at the who uses them and how, and there's a lot of inequity. So I think that's one of the things we have to study more about, how these preprint servers are not equitable for everyone, and how we can leverage them more to create a more equitable system in general, because there's a lot of evidence that suggests that there are certain privileged groups can use the archive and be able to benefit from it more than others, and that's a challenge. And yeah, well, we could talk one-on-one about, I have a lot of ideas about peer review and open peer review and all that stuff that I can share a little later.
Okay, Michelle, do you want to go on to
Sure.
double anonymous
Yeah.
peer review?
So the ACS is extremely interested in double anonymized peer review. It's not something that we currently offer, but when we talk to our authors, reviewers, and editors, that's one of the biggest requests that we see in focus groups and survey responses. Everyone suggests, you know, using double anonymized peer review as a way to make our processes more equitable. And I think the ACS, along with a lot of publishers, have been slow on this because of you know, technologies or investment in that, and Unfortunately, I think that's caused us to fall in that area. But I will say, you know, the ACS is really committed to improving our technology and improving the way we do things. And so I think in the near future, this is something that we'll definitely consider putting out there.
Are there any other publishers in the room that do double anonymized? Be kind of interesting from show of hands. No, you the Lone Ranger.
As a mic runner, can I still ask a question?
I think you have.
Okay, this is primarily, I guess, for Laura and Michelle. I'm Dana Compton from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And so I'm thinking about this question a little bit from the perspective of a publisher, but also from the perspective of an academic society leader. And I'm curious your thoughts about easing the pathway to volunteerism, I guess. You know, we also produce consensus documents and reports and those sorts of things, and we run a relatively robust journals program, and peer review is unpaid work. We have different practices about editorial board participation and whether that's also unpaid work. And I think we often think about volunteering as selfless, and I think being in the position to do volunteer work on top of your paid job is actually quite a privilege. And I also kind of keyed in, Michelle, on your comment about open calls for volunteer positions and your thoughts about maybe the benefit of coupling an open call with some targeted outreach, because we do know that underrepresented groups are more likely to hold themselves to a higher standard and not go for opportunities that they feel they're not qualified for. So just curious, how do we actually get that volunteer participation to be more diverse? I think it's a challenge.
Michelle, over to you.
Sure, yeah, I can go first. I think, yeah, peer review in particular is a tricky one, and I think publishers struggle with the ways of increasing your pool of reviewers because it is arduous work, and it is, you know, unpaid, unfortunately. I think there are ways in which publishers can show value of this work through incentives for reviewers, whether that be, you know, discounts for publishing, discounts to society meetings, awards around peer reviewing is also something that a lot of publishers do, just to kind of, you know, express that we are so thankful for that volunteer work. But yeah, I think the open nominations and kind of targeting various groups is so important. I know at the ACS we target so many different underrepresented communities for peer review and provide them with training. We'll go to their institutions and make sure that they understand kind of what we value and how they can get involved. And then through that peer review process, can they become an editor at one of our journals afterwards? So really wanting to show them that we value their work and hopefully can help them in bolstering their own career later on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you have to be very intentional, right, and be more proactive and reach out as opposed to sitting back, oh, they'll just come to us, right? It's not necessarily going to happen. We also, you know, as I mentioned, in terms of collecting our data, we also look at geographical diversity to make sure that we're getting individuals from different types of institutions, from different parts of the country. We recognize also the challenges that some of our institutions that don't necessarily have the resources to just stop their job and come and work on a 2-year consensus study from our tribal colleges or different HBCUs. So we're sort of looking at all of those different challenges and trying to find ways to make sure that we can engage, right, folks from across all different types of higher ed institutions. But not just academics. We're finding that a lot of our sponsors now, and given the different topics that we work on, we have to engage different community members. And what's the benefit to them if you don't get to put it on your CV, right? So thinking about different ways to provide that it's a partnership, right? It benefits us. How does it benefit you? How do we make it not extractive? We come in and we take the information and then we give you a report. But you know, so we're struggling with all of that and trying to learn from other organizations that do this much more, you know, effectively. And there was one more point I was going to make, and I just lost it. But I think we cannot, if we're only going to be engaging certain individuals from certain institutions and only academics, we're not going to have the impact that we have. And so happy to discuss this with anyone in the room who's interested, because we're just, oh, I know what I was going to say. There's a lot we've learned from the hiring process, and in particular search firms. So internally, we have a process where the staff will go out and put together a committee slate, and then it has to be approved by a series of folks, including ultimately our president. And there have been times where they've been sent back to the drawing board. You can't just say, oh, I looked at this field in physics and found no diversity. You kind of have to prove that you've turned every rock and that you've reached out to all the different organizations that you should be reaching out to, and not just say, I tried. So we've put a process in place to make sure, and no one wants to do the job twice and go back to the drawing board. So I think they're very intentional and very strategic in the beginning to try to get us to that end goal.
Right, I think we should break there. So thank you so much, Elaine, Michelle, and Laura. There's lots to think about. I'm feeling we really need to be intentional about this activity and to ensure that our leaders are really investing in this at the highest level of our organisations. It is a marathon, I think, as Elaine was saying, and so we have to be prepared to put in that legwork that's necessary. So thank you so much for our three speakers. I think they've been amazing, and we'll have you back at 11:45.